Hello everyone, this is Module 6, the penultimate module, second to last module, and I decided to do something a little different this time. I'm going to definitely cut these up into little pieces instead of doing one long hour-and-a-half video. Partly that's due to student feedback, and partly it's because Module 6 is particularly lends itself to being cut up like this. So let's get started. Part 1 will probably be the shortest one, though there is a good bit of ground to cover. I'm going to start with a question, kind of pick your brain. Let's say you meet a man who is shy, wears glasses, and dresses nice. Based on this information, what do you think is more likely? That this man is a librarian, or that this man is a waiter? I'll give you a few moments to think about it. If you're like most people, including myself, you were at least tempted to say, he sounds like a librarian. Shy, glasses, dressed nice. Sounds like a librarian. That's what your gut's telling you. A waiter, you think outgoing, maybe wears glasses, maybe doesn't, maybe dresses nice, maybe doesn't. But the description kind of leads you to believe librarian. Well, if you go with your gut might very well tell you librarian because the stereotype of a librarian seems to fit this description. If you don't go with your gut and you instead take some time to gather some facts, maybe lay out some stuff, be a little more methodical and rigorous, we might think for a second, well, how many librarians are there in the United States? We gotta say probably at least 100 per state. I mean, am I out of line here? So that would be 100 per state, 50 states, well, 5,000. That might be underestimating it. But then how many restaurants are there per state? Probably a lot more than 100 restaurants per state. I might be inclined to say there's 1,000 restaurants per state. And each of those restaurants is going to contain at least a dozen waiters and waitresses. It becomes pretty clear that the what is called base rate of the number of waiters and waitresses compared to librarians is very different. There are way more people that are waiters and waitresses than there are librarians. Librarians are just outnumbered. When you take this into consideration, that there by default is just more waiters than librarians, then you have to start asking, okay, well, how many waiters are shy? How many wear glasses? How many dress nice? If there's 10,000 waiters and only 100 librarians, how many librarians are shy, wear glasses, and dress nice? All 100? How many waiters fit this description? Even if it's just 1%, 1% of 10,000, if there's just that many more people, is above 100. I'm not good at doing mental math on the fly. Let's check that. 10,000 times 0.01. That is 100. So even if just 1% of waiters and waitresses fit this description, with the numbers we just came up with, this is just the back of the envelope. What did I just do? This is just the back of the envelope estimate. It would appear that there's just probably a greater likelihood overall that this person I described is a waiter. So despite with what your gut may have said at the beginning of this, if you really methodically, rigorously lay out the facts and try to think hard about this, it might become clear that in general, any given personality or appearance description of a person is just inherently more likely to apply to the more common category compared to the more rare category. Now, let me ask you a similar-ish question, but one that's a little more precise with the numbers. Let's say you have a breathalyzer test that has a 100% chance of detecting that someone is drunk. So if you're drunk, this breathalyzer will certainly, definitely say you're drunk. But there's a 5% chance that the breathalyzer will say that you're drunk when you're actually sober. So there are false positives, but it's only 5%. The rest of the time, the breathalyzer will not say that you're drunk when you're in fact not drunk and you're sober. Now, let's say we are going to pluck a random person out of the United States population. I know it's 5 o'clock somewhere at all times. Let's say it's 5 o'clock. But, how many people are really drunk? Like, if you just pick 1,000 people at random, how many of them would happen to be drunk? Let's say, for the purpose of this thought exercise, that 0.1% of people at any given moment at 5 o'clock are drunk. So, I draw someone completely at random, and I take their breathalyzer, and the breathalyzer says they're drunk. What is the probability that they're actually drunk? Think on that for a second. I'm going to talk about the answer later in one of the other parts. But you might be experiencing your gut telling you one thing, and you might have this nagging feeling that, well, I know my gut is telling me one thing. I don't know what will happen if I actually try to rigorously and methodically solve this, but we definitely know what our gut is telling us. But we'll come back to this. Well, I talked about these examples because one of the biggest things to happen in psychology in the 70s and 80s, this is the part of the history of psychology that we're getting to towards this turn of the century, getting close to the year 2000. One of the biggest things going on during this time period is that psychology as a discipline saw its first Nobel Prize winners. Now, there is no Nobel Prize in psychology. There's only a Nobel Prize in economics is the closest thing they have. But they have awarded the Nobel Prize in economics to some psychologists. Herb Simon in 1957, his work in 1957 got him the Nobel Prize in 1978. Herb Simon worked on this thing called bounded rationality. It's basically the view that, as humans, we have limited information processing power. That means we're not computers. We can't just crunch numbers. We have our limits, both in terms of speed and accuracy, in terms of how much information we can accurately process. We also have limits in our knowledge. We don't know all the facts. We sometimes, even if we do our little back of the envelope estimations, we might not be good at even coming up with a basis for that. So Herb Simon talked about how within the constraints and the boundaries of our limitations, we can act rationally. We can make decisions which, in light of our limitations, make the best out of our limited information, our limited information processing capacity. So that was Herb Simon, first psychologist ever to win a Nobel Prize, although the Nobel Prize was in economics. The next time that a psychologist or psychologists, in this case, won the Nobel Prize was the work of Kahneman and Tversky. Their work in 1979 won them the Nobel Prize in 2002, and they won this award because they came up with something called prospect theory. Prospect theory is a mathematical theory of decision making. Basically, it takes inputs for each option. If you have to choose option A or option B, each option has outcomes that are possible, and there are probabilities associated with those outcomes. So if you're going to invest your money or not invest your money, there are outcomes. If you invest your money, after a long enough time period, hopefully you will get a return on that investment. If you don't invest your money, you can have your money to spend now, but you might have less money later. These are outcomes. But there are different probabilities. How likely is it that you'll have money, a return on your investment? How likely is it that you won't have more money later if you don't invest it now? When you go and get a medical procedure, you might be in the unfortunate situation where you have to make a decision. Should I get, let's say, a a surgical procedure, which is likely to fix my problem but could have serious side effects? Or should I undergo some kind of treatment where it's going to be long and drawn out and won't have any side effects, but there's less of a chance that it'll actually reduce my the underlying cause of my symptoms? So you hear all these ifs, ands, and buts, and maybes, and coulds, possibly, maybe, regarding these different consequences. Well, prospect theory is a way of describing how people take the potential consequences weighted by the probability of these consequences occurring, and it does so with mathematical rigor. This was a big discovery. Obviously, it looks very scientific. It has all the trappings of a very impressive scientific. It's got equations and everything. I don't have the equations up here. And economists took it and ran with it and started applying prospect theory to economic research and found that it fit with how individuals make decisions. It even seems to fit in when you do psychological research. You ask people, would you choose option A or option B in this situation? Prospect theory does a really good job of accurately describing how people make their decisions. So what are the contents of prospect theory? I'm going to give a quick and dirty, kind of rough and ready description of what prospect theory says. Basically, for your outcomes, we're going to stick with money because that's really honestly what prospect theory is best at dealing with, is dollars and cents and probabilities, numbers. What prospect theory says is that the difference between getting $50 is a nice outcome. We really like that. But gains above a certain threshold start to kind of level off. So you see, if I drew a 45-degree angled line here and just kept going up, this might be where the 100 mark is. But earning $100 is not sought twice as much as earning $50. After a certain point, gains have this diminishing return. We're not going to work twice as hard to earn $100 compared to $50. For losses, $50 hurts, and we avoid losing $50 way more than equivalent gains. So earning $50 is great, but losing it is way worse than gaining it is great. Losses loom larger than gains. It's a great little turn of phrase. We fear losing X amount of money more than we seek gaining that amount of money. That's the outcome part of it. Diminishing returns on gains, and losses loom larger than gains. We have loss aversion. We fear losing things more than we like gaining things. As far as the probability side of things, when you give someone when you say, I'm going to flip a coin, heads, you're going to get $100, and tails, you get nothing. Ideally, with any kind of probability associated with a gamble like that, or any kind of decision that involves uncertainty, if you say there's a 50% chance, they would treat it like it's a 50% chance. See, down here on the x-axis is the objective probability, the probability I gave you. And the y-axis here is how much weight you put into the decision. So you don't really treat 50% like it's 50%. We actually kind of downplay, like 50% is not certain enough. So we tend to, if something only has a 50% chance, we tend to devalue it and act like it has less of a chance of happening than it really does. In fact, as stated probabilities grow, we treat them less and less like they're as large as they are. It's not until you get to a 100% probability that people start to see it as a sure thing, and they come back to this line right here. This line, the dotted line, represents how a computer or an android would treat this situation. If you say there's an 85% chance of winning $100 versus some other option, I'm going to weight the $100 as if it's worth exactly $85, which is $100 weighted by 85%. And the machine will make that, will choose that bet over something that's worth less than $85 in the long run. But as humans, 15% chance to get $100 doesn't sound that great. I mean, 85% chance to get $100 doesn't sound that great. That sounds to us like that's not worth our while. So for large probabilities, we kind of underestimate how worthwhile they are in the grand scheme of things. And for low probability events, like if I say there's a 10% chance of happening, we tend to treat something that has only a 10% chance happening or only a 5% chance of happening as if it's a lot more likely than it really is. So, in other words, we tend to overweight unlikely things and underweight likely things. If something is unlikely to happen, we treat it as if it's more likely to happen than it really is. If something is likely to happen, but there's still a chance it might not, we kind of underappreciate that. So we don't weight probabilities in our decisions in a perfectly linear way, the way an android or a computer might. Here's a nice little meme I found. It's actually not about prospect theory, but it conveys something from prospect theory pretty accurately. So this lady's saying, is 200% a lot? And this guy says, well, depends on the context. Gains? No. Losses? Yes. So this comes from the, I think it's something on Reddit. People are obsessed with this investing with GameStop stock or something. They got into investing. And it's true, it's kind of a joke. This is where that came from, is that community where if you see a 200% return on your investment, that's not considered that great. Like if you invest $100, a 200% return would be $300. So if you sold your shares, you'd have $300 when you invested $100. And in their community, they're like, oh, that's nothing. But when you lose, when your investment goes down 200%, that's a big deal. And this fits with prospect theory that losses loom larger than gains. Numerically, a loss of 200% is terrible, but a gain of 200% is not that big of a deal. So that was prospect theory. I didn't go deep into the equations because you saw these functions right here. You put gains and losses in, and the x-axis and the y-axis represents the amount of pleasure or pain or happiness or suffering we experience as a result of those gains and losses. Here we have another function where you have the stated probability at the horizontal axis, and you have how we treat that probability psychologically on the y-axis. There are equations that govern these functions, but I didn't go over them. I just want you to know the gist of prospect theory. But Kahneman and Tversky hit it big with prospect theory. They had the attention of people outside of psychology, the Nobel Committee, and they started working on a more general framework for understanding human judgment and decision making. And this was called the biases and heuristics framework. And this is the idea that humans have these gut feelings. We have these kind of rude and crude ways of making decisions and solving problems that are good enough to get the job done. And the job of psychologists is to figure out what are these mental shortcuts? What are these kind of rough and ready, they'll get the job done most of the time, kind of tools that we use. Because if you are an advertiser, a marketer, a car salesman, a politician, if you can learn what these biases and heuristics are, then you can exploit them. You can use fear to get people to vote for you instead of your opponent, because Fear sometimes works better than a rational, rigorous exploration of the pros and cons of different policies, your economic policy. Instead, just say, well, my opponent wants to plunge us into tyranny and socialism or anarchy or something like that. And, Kahneman and Tversky started this framework of saying, look, humans deviate in predictable ways from what a rational computer or android would do, and our job is to figure out what are these deviations, so that if we can better understand them, we can then try to address them. From Kahneman and Tversky's work came a new sub-branch of economics called behavioral economics. This is where mostly economists incorporate psychological theory into their understanding, mostly of microeconomics. And there are some investment firms that are founded on behavioral economic theory where you can beat the market by using psychological insights and buying undervalued stocks and selling them for more than you bought them for and whatnot. There is a very active, very well-funded area of research that is related to this called nudge research. This is Richard Thaler started this research up in 2008 on nudges. And he won. He's an economist, so I don't really consider him to be a psychologist that won a Nobel Prize. But he won a Nobel Prize in economics, and he's an economist, so I don't really count that as a win for the discipline. But a nudge is basically an application of behavioral economics where you affect people's behavior not by coercion and not by incentives. You see, coercion's a good way to affect behavior when you say, if you don't do what I tell you, you're going to jail, or you're going to time out, or I'm going to raise your taxes, or if you do this, I'll lower your taxes, I'll make it tax deductible. That's something that's very familiar to economists. Apart from incentives, you have coercion, where you force people, they don't have a choice. A nudge is when you're not changing the incentives and you're not coercing anyone. You're merely reframing or kind of selectively presenting the options. So, great go-to example is organ donation. There was a country in Europe that had a big problem. They had a big shortage of donated tissues and organs. They were losing out on a lot of lives. They were failing to save a lot of lives that could have been saved because they didn't have adequate organ donation rates. Too many people were saying they do not want to be organ donors. So they looked at it. When you sign up to get your driver's license in this country, I forget where it was. It might have been Norway. I don't remember the details. They looked and they said, okay, well, when you're filling out this card to get your driver's license, there's a box that says, would you like to be an organ donor? One box says yes, one box says no. And a lot of people were saying, no, I don't want to be an organ donor. Well, all they did was they changed it and said, would you like to opt out of being an organ donor? That is, would you like to avoid being an organ donor? It's the same question, just reworded, and the same responses. One box for yes, one box for no. So before they're saying, would you like to be an organ donor? After they're saying, would you like to opt out of being an organ donor? And it was night and day. People don't want to say that they don't want to be an organ donor. Organ donations went up tremendously in this country, and they were able to save lots of lives. And no incentives or arguably no coercion was used. They merely reformatted the question. They reworded the question. So that is a quick rundown of some of the the biggest, most consequential things that were going on towards the turn of the century. Is this business with biases and heuristics, prospect theory, the emergence of behavioral economics. For part 2 of the video, I'm going to talk about the rise of neuroscience, and I'll see y'all then.